Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Evening Lecture Series co-sponsored by the Belfast Garden Club and the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues project of the Belfast Free Library. Together, we are pleased to bring you tonight's program, RX for a Chaotic Climate, Healthy Soils, with State Representative and soil scientist Laurie Osher. I'm Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Tonight's presentation is the final one in our series of 3 evening programs that addressed the effects of the climate crisis on our local environments, as well as exploring some of the possible solutions. I'm joined tonight by Belfast Garden Club Program Committee members, Barbara Bell and Susan Connard. Before I turn the mic over to Barbara, who will introduce our speaker, I'd like to let you know that you can find out more about the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues project and what we've been up to, and learn about future programs by going to the belfastlibrary.org/ABCD events. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel, which you may access from our website. During the presentation, please keep your mics muted and type any of your questions in the chat, and Susan Connard will read them during the Q&A after the talk. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Barbara Bell. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Brenda. Laurie Osher is a soil scientist, a Maine state legislator who has introduced and co-sponsored bills on soils, and a climate resilience specialist for the Eastern Maine Development Corporation, who works out in the fields consulting with farmers about their soils when she's able to do that. She has other hats too, which you've read about in the announcements for this program. Tonight, she's going to at least start off talking about her hat as a legislator, because she's in Augusta involved in the beginnings of their work, or the middle of their work, at any rate in their work. So Laurie, we look forward to hearing from you right now.
Well, thank you so much, and hello everyone. And I want to thank you for inviting me, and also for to the Belfast Library and the Belfast Garden Club for organizing events where you can all get together, even if it's virtually, and learn about climate change and soil health, and also know that you have other people interested in similar things. So I think that the way we're going to address and be resilient to climate change is to work in community with each other, and support each other in addressing local and regional, national and global issues by working together. So thank you so much. Just the fact that there's a screen full of people interested is very heartening for me. So as Barbara mentioned, I am a soil scientist. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia, but I just loved gardening and I loved soils. I didn't actually realize that soils was its own discipline. And so I didn't actually want to go to college, because I just wanted to grow food. And I didn't think that you needed to go to college for that. I ended up going to college. I went to work on a kibbutz in Israel, what would have been my senior year in high school. And there I met someone who was working on his PhD in soil physics, and realized that you could actually study this and try to help agriculture do better by being a scientist. So I was hooked, and I went an undergraduate as a soil scientist, and then I worked for the Soil Conservation Service, mapping soils. I got my master's in pedology, which is how soils form and how they're distributed on the landscape. And then I mapped soils for the federal government. So I worked as a consultant for a little bit. Then I worked for the federal government. I worked for USAID in South America, and I worked in 3 different forests for the USDA Forest Service. Then I went to graduate school, because while I was at the Forest Service, part of my job was to do environmental impact assessments for proposed projects. So the foresters would want to be cutting trees, or the engineers would be putting in roads. There would be a proposed ski area when I worked in Colorado. And in all of those things that were proposed, because the National Environmental Policy Act, there needs to be environmental impact assessments. And I would write assessments. And one of the things that I wrote when I was in Northern California, where there were very large trees and very steep landscapes, was that when the trees were cut off, that there would be a loss of carbon from the soils, because the forest had a deep duff layer, especially on the north-facing slopes. And so in my environmental impact assessment, I said that removing the forests on the north-facing slope would have a big impact on the climate, that if we did that everywhere, we would have a big flux of CO2. And at that time, in the late 80s, there was already a problem with increasing CO2, and that we needed to manage land to reduce carbon flux to the atmosphere. And what I was told is there's no federal policy that tells us that's why we manage land. There's federal policies for endangered species and for you can't cut close to a riparian zone, which is where by the shores of a lake or a stream or a river. But there was no federal policy that said, in my vernacular, thou shalt not cut the forest because the soils are storing carbon. And the continued interest in by that there was very few popular press books about climate change, but I had been interested in the fact that we were increasing CO2 since I was very young, that the fossil fuels that we were burning were going to be changing our climate. And so I went off to Berkeley to study how, if you manage land to store, how you could manage land to store carbon. And so I compared forest and grassland and monoculture agricultural systems. I was also looking at soil mineralogy and chemistry. So lots of details I don't need to share, but my general assumption was that if scientists created the data that showed how this would be a benefit to manage land in a way to store carbon, or at least not lose as much carbon, that the policies would follow. I finished my PhD in 1997, and we do not have any state or federal policies that say thou shalt manage the land to store carbon. So that's an aside. I came to after my postdoc, and in my postdoc, I was also studying land use and carbon storage in soils. And then I came to UMaine to be a faculty member in 1999. And actually, I started studying estuaries, because when I was looking at all the landscapes in Maine, it was clear that the most carbon was stored in the mud of the estuary. And that since that short stint I had as a consultant, I lived in Boston, and back then, as now, it was so expensive in Boston that people were buying or living further and further north of Boston. And so it was pretty clear that when people could communicate as we are remotely, that people would start living in what had been built as summer residences, would be living in the year round. So I thought of the estuaries as there are going to be two impacts. One is all of the flushing that people do from their homes would go into septic systems that weren't designed to be working during frozen times. And we'd have eutrophication of the coastal systems. And so eutrophication meaning nutrients go in and then you get algal blooms, and that wouldn't be good for ecosystems. And the other would that people would want to change the coastal zones and maybe dredge where there's estuaries now, so people who had money could bring in their boats to go to their houses. And so because the image of the coast is often not an estuary, people think of living on a rocky coastline in Maine, even though we do have a lot of estuaries. So anyway, so that's how I started to change my focus to estuaries. But so still I was thinking about carbon. I ended up after 9 years at UMaine, I decided to start my own business. And my business was what my hobby had been, which was making buildings more energy efficient. Because as you can imagine, now that I can tell you it's been so long that I started thinking about soils and carbon, and there's still no policy about it. It wasn't very immediate. Mapping soils is immediate. You put the line on the map, you discuss it with a few people, and it becomes a map. It may take a while for the map to actually get printed, but now that we have GIS, it's pretty quick between just making a decision of what the soils should be delineated as and then having it go on a map, or at least a GIS. And that's not the same for academia and doing research. And so I was fixing houses and churches and helping to be more energy efficient. It was very immediate. As soon as you weatherize a house or a church, It uses less fuel and it's more comfortable. And so anyway, I did that as a hobby. Then I ended up doing that as a business. And while I was doing that as a business, I saw Trump running for president, and the discussion during his primary, it became really clear to me that we needed people who were, this is, again, there's no soils policies, there's no soil carbon storage policy, and then we have all these people who are anti-science running for elected office. And so I decided that I would run for local office and start locally, think locally, start locally. And I ran for my town council and found that it was even challenging to get the town of Orono, which is, you would think would be a pretty progressive town. It was a big push to get the town to say that we were going to address climate change, that we were going to work on energy efficiency of our buildings. And because people were concerned that how much cost it would be to invest into the study of the buildings to find out how to make them more energy efficient. Even though all of the data shows that investing in making your buildings energy efficient cuts the cost of heating those buildings. And from the climate perspective, the best energy efficiency, the best energy is energy you don't use. And so reducing energy use was my goal for buildings, and I was trying to do it for municipal buildings. Anyway, I ran for office because it seemed important. And then we have term limits here in the legislature. And so people who run for office and are successful only have 4 terms that they can serve. They either have to sit out and run again or run for the Senate. So the person who was doing a great job in Orono was in his last term. And so I ran for the legislature because I thought it was important to have someone who thought about climate change in the legislature and energy efficiency. And then when I got to the legislature, I realized there are no soils policies. There's no soil carbon storage policies. And so even though I ran as a generalist, I ran just saying that Orono needed good representation. And I'm not sure how the politics are in Belfast. I know Jan Dodge, but I can say that in Orono, there's a few towns in the whole state that they can have a very progressive, lefty, whatever person run, and they could get elected over and over. And Orono is one of those towns. And so I didn't run as a soil scientist. I ran as, I'm going to be very progressive. I'm going to say things that you can't say in other towns in Orono and get reelected. And people voted for me over the more conservative Democrat that was running. And so I came to Augusta to put in bills about gender affirming care. I have 2 bills on gender affirming care and HIV testing and bills on taxing the rich and things that can be considered controversial by people who want to get reelected in conservative towns. And but I did think, what do I have to bring? So I put in a bill. Well, first I co-sponsored the soil health bill in the 130th. That's the last legislative session, was the 130th. So I co-sponsored the soil health bill. It was sponsored by, the lead sponsor was Senator Stacey Brenner. She has a flower farm in, I think it's Scarborough, Maine. And she works part-time for the Maine Farmland Trust. And the bill talked about how we would have a program in the state to encourage healthy soils. And so the bill was primarily about education, so that there would be a person that worked for the state government, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, and their job would be to go and talk to farmers about healthy soils. And so, Barbara, actually, I don't go and talk to farmers right now. It hasn't, since I left the university, I haven't been my day job, I haven't been a soil scientist. So I am on the Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry Committee, and we hear bills twice a week, and we interact with farmers often, and many of the people on that committee are farmers. They unanimously supported the soil health bill, and the soil health bill passed in the legislature and became law. However, there was no funding. There was not even funding for this person that would be the soil scientist that worked at the state level to lead the program. because of a retirement, the state government was able to fill that position last summer using the funds that had originally been approved for another person, the person who used to educate people about septic systems. And since the majority of the homes in the state are on septic systems, that's a pretty important job, but that job has been morphed into the soil health position. The soil health position, that person's job is to talk about ways in which farms primarily, but also forests and conservation lands and coastal lands can be managed for soils to be healthy. And having a high amount of soil organic matter is one way that soils are healthy, because organic matter holds moisture and it's a source for nutrients. It also holds nutrients. And so, and also we are experiencing more extreme weather events that include greater possibility there'd be a drought. So I was sitting with Bill Pluker tonight, I was at a Democratic caucus meeting before I came to talk with you. And Bill Pluker is the House chair of the Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry Committee, and he is a farmer. And he said, when I started 20 years ago, I didn't need any irrigation. And about 10 years ago, it was very clear that if I didn't invest in irrigation, that I wouldn't be able to grow things in certain parts of my farm. And he said, and now this year, because I'm in the legislature, I'm planting less because I don't have enough areas irrigated to make it worthwhile to plant them, because we have such more commonly, we have drought conditions through the summer in Maine. And that's one of the things with healthy soils is the more moisture you have in the soil, the better chance that it will hold the rain the more organic matter you have in the soil, the better chance it will hold the moisture. And instead of having that moisture move through the soil profile and be out of range of the plants that you're growing. So the soil health bill. So I did co-sponsor the soil health bill, and I sponsored another bill, which was turned into a resolve. But the original bill was that we should incentivize, meaning pay people who store carbon in the soil and do practices that would enhance carbon storage as organic matter. We have a nonpartisan staff that helps us write the bills. They're mostly lawyers, but lawyers are paralegals, and their job is to help us write the terminology so that it fits within Maine law and it makes sense and it's something you could actually legislate, that you could make policy out of. And the reviser said to me 2 years ago, when I put in my soil carbon incentives bill, storage incentives, meaning that the people would be paid for increasing the carbon in their soils or managing them to increase carbon. He said, how much carbon and how much money you would pay people to do this? And I said, those are really good questions. My research was not for upland, forest, grasslands, and monocultural agriculture was not in Maine. And it was years ago. So I'm not quite sure how in Maine we would do this. What I do know is, since I was in ag school 40 years ago, the Farm Bill has a place in it where it pays farmers to not till wetlands. So that has been in there because it used to be there weren't no crop insurance. And so people who had farms, they tilled up and planted the wetlands because they could not predict the weather. And planting the wetlands was the equivalent of farm insurance, because in a drought year, the only place that you would be able to produce your crop was in the wettest part of your fields. And so people had the practice of tilling up wetlands, which was fine until we got to be the kind of country where every square acre was farmed. And then we did not have wetlands, and wetlands are so important for habitat for wildlife, among other things. And so the Farm Bill had a place in it where it allowed people to be paid so that they wouldn't farm wetlands. Then we got crop insurance, and so you really didn't need to farm wetlands. So right now we have people in America who are farmers who still get paid or get an incentive to not farm wetlands, and they and their parents maybe never tilled the wetland on the farm where they are. So I know that that's one of the challenges in policy, is that once you put it into policy, it often doesn't get taken out. But what I said to the reviser is, I want to model it on the Farm Bill, where we pay people not to farm wetlands. I want to pay people to do the right thing for soil carbon storage. And what because we couldn't come up with how much, and since this last year, a bill passed in Maryland where they pay people $50 an acre for a certain amount of carbon. So Maryland has done it for croplands. So what we did last term was that we turned it into a resolve. A resolve is the terminology as opposed to an act. An act is thou shalt, and thou shalt change the law in this way. A resolve is there's a one-time thing we're going to say needs to happen. And so the resolve was to make a report that studied how we would incentivize carbon storage in Maine soils. And the report was made jointly by the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And what in fact happened is that they were able to apply for a grant to cover the cost of that from the federal government. And the money went to University of Maine, and that two students that had recently graduated, one with a master's and one with a PhD. One with the master's was in soil science, the PhD was in sustainable agriculture, and they did all the research to come up with a report that came out in September of last year, and 15 recommendations on what the state could do to incentivize carbon storage. And so right now, yesterday, Friday, I was working with the reviser on that bill because I put a bill in that said I want to enact the recommendations of the soil carbon incentives report from the last session. And so we are working on figuring out how much money would go to what programs that would encourage. And so there's programs that already exist. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service has programs, and we had the state and the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, that part of their job was to work with the NRCS to bring those programs to the state, but that has been flat funded. And since costs have gone up, that means that there's been less and less of a person's time devoted to working with the NRCS to help bring the federal programs to people of farmers and land managers in Maine in a way that they can grasp what it is that they need to do to be able to store more carbon and get paid for it. So anyway, so I'm working on that bill right now. The Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry put in a request to fund the Healthy Soils program. That would, this person that has a job but doesn't have any money within his program would be able to have money within his program where he would be able to work with farmers, walk their land, encourage them to do, let's say, do a cover crop, or to switch to no-till agriculture. And both of those things keep carbon in the ground because it keeps the ground cooler. And you know that when the warmth hits the ground, there are microbes that munch down organic matter. And the warmer the surface soil gets, the more you'll have CO2 loss as a function of the microbes breaking down organic matter and turning some of that into CO2. And so if you can keep the ground cooler, not only does it stay more moist, but it keeps carbon, soil organic matter in the form that it can be kept as a sequestered or at least stored below ground. So that's the process of making a bill that works and that people will vote for is a challenging one, and that's what I'm working on. You can ask me some more specific questions about how we're doing that, but the idea is, so one of the reasons the bill is not completed yet is after I talked to the person in the revisor's office, he said, well, now you have to talk to someone, the person who is in the Office of Financial, Office of something financial, that there's a person from this office that deals with the finances of the costs of government that is appointed to the Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry Committee. So I have an appointment with him tomorrow to talk about how much we put into each line item, the line item to work with NRCS, the line item to teach people about how to change their land management to have more carbon storage, the line item to perhaps pay per acre for people who do make changes. The chances that that gets funded, that's another challenge, because if you might have heard that we had we're going to be voting on the budget this week, and the Republicans would like us to cut money out of the budget, and the governor and the majority, which are the Democrats in the House and the Senate and the legislature, we would like to increase the budget from what it was last time, so that we can fund programs that have not been funded in years. We had 8 years of a very sort of tax slashing governor and legislature, and by slashing the taxes that came in, that means there was less revenue. And so that means many things weren't funded. And so now that we have the Governor Mills and Democratic majority in the House and Senate, we are trying to fund things that have been long underfunded. So for me to come up with a new program that's a little hard for people to get their mind around, because although I love soils and I think about soils, and you as gardeners think about soils, to get people to say, yes, that's important to fund is a bigger challenge. On the positive note, my dissertation topic title included the words soil carbon sequestration and loss. And for years, when I told people about what I did for a study, they would look at me blankly when I said sequestration. And maybe some people would say, like a jury is sequestered. And I would say, yes, put away, sequestered. And so I got used to just saying soil carbon storage, even though the word sequestered implies, and as a chemist, that there's a form in which the organic matter is, in my case, I was looking at how it was connected to iron oxide. And because once connected to iron oxide, it's much harder for microbes to get at, and therefore it has a longer residence time. Even if the temperature goes up, the microbes are less likely to be able to munch that. I used to call it little Pac-Man, to munch along and it release that CO2. So sequestration is a better terminology for what I was studying than just storage, because storage doesn't describe how strongly that organic matter is held in the soil. But I got used to, for a decade or plus, just saying I studied soil carbon storage. And when I got into the legislature and I made this bill last year to incentivize soil carbon storage, someone who is not anyway related to science said to me, maybe it was even Jan Dodge, because she was a teacher, said to me, "Oh, you mean soil carbon sequestration?" And I thought, yay, that showed that, people like me talking about it, people like you talking about your interest in climate change, your interest in how ecosystems work, how gardens work, that had made it into the parlance of an educated person, and that didn't need to have a background in soil science. So I'm excited that it's understood as an important thing. Whether it gets funded is another question, and so we'll see about that. Okay, so my goal was to introduce myself, to say a little bit about my background and how I got to this, and then talk about this bill that I've been working on. In the summary about what I'm working on, it also mentioned the pesticide bills. As I said, I'm on the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee, and I put in 2 bills last session about the Board of Pesticide Control. Now, that was created in the 80s because people were concerned that there was an increase in pesticide use around the state. And the original intent was that we should monitor the pesticides that are sold and applied in Maine, and the state should keep track get annual records from the people who are selling and applying them, and report back to the legislature and say whether or not they've increased or not. Also, the Board of Pesticide Control was supposed to teach people about integrated pest management, with the goal of that people who applied pesticides would understand and know about alternatives that are not chemicals. So you could have a non-chemical, some biological, or some way that you manage the landscape to reduce the need to apply a chemical pesticide. So the Board of Pesticide Control does collect paper records annually of what's applied. And however, pretty much from the get-go, it became clear that they did not have the person power and the money to pay to take that information and organize it in a way that they could actually find out how much was applied across the state because everyone's sending them paper, and the quality control was poor. And so during the LePage administration, the requirement for the state to report back to the legislature was disappeared. And so one of my goals in one of my Board of Pesticide Control bills of the last session was to reinstate that people would actually have to report. And because now we have databases, they didn't have them in the 80s, that would be accessible and easy to work with. I had this idea that we would have a state database and that there'd be an app and you could just upload your information. And the people who apply pesticides have to be certified, and to be certified, you must keep a logbook with what you apply, what plant you're applying it for, what the weather was like on the day you applied and where you applied it. And so as one of the college students who's working as an intern with me said, it's as if they have done their homework and they have not handed it in, because what I'm asking is nothing more than what they have to do to keep their certification as a pesticide applicator. And the people who are selling pesticides, they keep all the records so that they can file their taxes, because they buy those pesticides and then they sell those pesticides. And so they have all of the information about what they bought and what they sold. And so getting it so that the state could analyze it is what I was requesting in the bill. I had a lot of pushback. It did not pass last time. So I am putting that in, taking what I heard from the farmers and the business people who work with pesticides, taking into account what they didn't like about it last time, and we're going to pass it this time, I hope. The other pesticide bill I put in last time, which did pass, was as someone who reviewed the bill, the person in the revisor's office when it was reviewing the bill, that it was a bill about the who was on the Board of Pesticide Control. And again, there was originally a description that one of the people on the board had to be an IPM, integrated pest management specialist, and there had to be a doctor, and that doctor had to be knowledgeable about the impact of toxins on humans. And there were some other requirements for who was going to be seated on that board. And during the LePage administration, they stripped out the things that would have made people on that board represent those who are a little concerned about the use of chemicals in our environment. And so the doctor that was on the Board of Pesticide Control had worked for chemical companies, you know, almost exclusively. And the IPM specialist, there was not one anymore. And so I did put in a bill that we would basically, so the guy from the revisor's office said, oh, it's industry capture. That's what that happened to this board. That's so basically that it turned into a puppet for the industry. And so I was able to pass that the who was on the Board of Pesticide Control would better represent people who are a little concerned about the proliferation of chemicals. When we look back to the 80s to now, of course, there are going to be more and more pesticides applied or chemicals applied, even if we're doing IPM, because the chemical companies are in the business of making new products all the time, because each product they make becomes, because of patents, eventually they want to make something new so they can sell something for the time in which they have a patent on it, and it is exclusive. And so we have more and more chemicals all the time, partly because of the way the economy works with inventions. So anyway, so that's my Board of Pesticide Control bills, and I've gone on enough. I will tell you, if you have questions, I can talk to you about the, I said I was not going to talk that long, and here I am talking that long. Sorry. I can answer questions about other things that I do, like my job with climate resilience. So how about questions?
Okay, thanks a lot. You've covered a lot of ground there in an hour. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to ask people, you can either put questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, go down to the bottom and use the reactions function to raise your hand. You'll come up to the front of the line so we can call on you. Right now, there's a question about, could you describe some ways that gardeners can work to sequester carbon in their own gardens and advise others how to do so?
All right, well, thank you. That's an excellent question. So the first is that any gardener if you're gardening at home, your home produces organic waste, and that organic waste should not go into the trash, because once it goes into a landfill, then it becomes a source of methane, because landfills tend to be anoxic, not much oxygen. And the microbes that are always looking to make a living off of organic matter that live in landfills, they break down that organic matter, and in the absence of oxygen, they turn that organic matter to methane. That's the part that goes into the gas form. And methane is a much higher greenhouse gas problem than CO2. And so the first step is that you shouldn't be putting things into the waste stream that are organic, that are compostable. And so you should be making your own compost pile. So the great thing about having what carbon benefit could be gained by converting lawns to shrub? Great questions. So, okay, so the first is that you should compost your own waste, and then you can use that compost to cover the ground and make a mulch layer. Or you can, once it's completely composted, you can turn it into your garden and then have organic matter. So you can make a mulch layer. And as I mentioned, the more the ground is shielded from the heat of the sun and from warming up during the day, the better chance it's going to be storing more organic matter for a longer period of time. So the question was about carbon sequestration in gardens. Is that true? Or am I just so loving carbon sequestration?
No, I think you got the questions. There's another question. Will your proposed bill work through the soil and water conservation districts, and how can we weigh in to provide support to you?
Thank you so much. So I said there's one other question out loud, and I will get to that one next. So yes, so I spoke with Mac Boucher, and he is the person who got that job as the soil health specialist. And what he said is, he's the one who told me that the money for the NRCS was flat funded. And he also said that one of the challenges they have is that with the soil and water conservation districts, that people need funds often to change their land management. So if you wanted to change to no-till, you need different equipment than when you're tilling with conventional tillage. And so that is an investment in changing equipment. And it takes a long time to get the funding through the Farm Services Agency, which has low-cost loans for farmers, but they take a long time. So then farmers end up trying to go to local banks, and the interest is higher. And often they need to have some money up front to show that they, just like in many kinds of transactions, you have to make a deposit. So one of the things we're putting into the soil, the carbon incentives bill, is specifically funding so that soil and water conservation districts can direct farmers to a state fund that will help them to basically change their land management and to have the cash to do that work. So that's yeah. So that, thank you for mentioning that. I didn't mention that there's different line items that we are trying to fund each separately, and one is the NRCS relationships, and the other is the soil and water conservation districts. And thank you for saying that you want to be supportive. What I will do is I will send Barbara the information with the talking points about the bill, so that when it's coming for a public hearing, that you could present testimony. So Maine is a fabulous state in the sense of its public opportunities for the public to be involved. Any person who wants to present testimony gets 3 minutes to present your testimony. And you can present it in writing, and you can be as long as you want. But if you want to present in a public hearing, you get 3 minutes. This is different than in other states. In California, if a sponsor presents a bill in a public hearing, they have 10 minutes, and they can use that 10 minutes however they want. And so that means if you wanted to have 5 people speak, they would each get an average of 2 minutes. Well, in Maine, it goes on and on. For we legislators that do not get paid very much, that means a bill that people are very interested in, it could be 7 hours of public testimony at 3 minutes apiece. But that is still your right to give that testimony. So that compared to California, where it's a huge state with a much larger population and bills, and in other states, if someone wants to crush a bill so that it doesn't get heard, the leadership can just get rid of it. In our state, if a bill comes before the legislature, it gets a hearing. And so if you would like to participate, I will send talking points. And if you want, we could even have a Zoom like workshop on writing public testimony, where I didn't bring a PowerPoint, but basically I could put up an example of a public testimony from various different people on the same bill, so you can see how they differ. So I didn't know this. I used to give public testimony, but I didn't. Now that I'm in the legislature and I'm seeing bills, I might have. Just yesterday, there was a bill about, they called it canned hunting, that we heard about. Canned hunting meaning that that people raise wild animals in an enclosure where they roam free within a gated area, and then hunters come and kill them. And so it was heard in agriculture, conservation, and forestry, because they maintain this is basically like agriculture. So in agriculture, you might grow chickens in an enclosure, in a house, a chicken house, and then you raise them to kill them. And so the people who do this for a living, where they have enclosures and invite hunters to come and kill, say, elk or some other animal, that's a business. There are 6 businesses like that in our state, and someone put in a bill to make that illegal in our state. And I got testimony, identical letters from all over the country, because the National Rifle Association put out a call to all their members. And so I opened up every one, because I couldn't tell by the email whether they're my constituents or even if they were from Maine. But my email inbox has been filled for the last several days with basically the exact same letter. And that letter was not only sent to me by email, but also submitted in the electronic format at the state website for putting in testimony. So I would be able to show examples of these, of short letters that are forms that are created by some organization versus a testimony that gives a personal story. And those for me are the most, seem to have the most impact. So yeah, so yes, you can help. I will send Barbara, and I do offer, if you would like to, if somebody wants to have a short workshop that we could talk about it, you can ask questions about the specific bill and the talking points. I'd be happy to do that. All right,
so we have a few additional questions. I guess you can see both of them because they're to everyone, so yes, you should be able to see them.
So Fred asks, what carbon benefit could be gained by converting lawns to shrub forest and perennial plants? So Fred, obviously you probably know that that's going to be better than lawns. There's more biomass stored above ground in a shrub forest than there is in a lawn. What I was surprised to find in my study, my research for my PhD was in Hawaii, and the grasslands I was studying were very, compared to where I worked in the Forest Service, where grasslands were overgrazed. They were public lands, and they tended to be overgrazed by the people who were using the allotments. In Hawaii, they have lush grasslands, and they're not very heavily grazed. And what I found is that the carbon stored per time was fastest in the grassland. And so lawns, if we were to let our lawns grow, and that they might actually store a lot of carbon, because those plants are very good at growing fine roots every year and filling the soil with fine roots. And only a certain percent of those are decomposed, and the rest end up getting stored. So if the lawn were not mowed, but we have all sorts of ordinances often that you have to mow your lawn. So if the lawn were not mowed, it could be good for carbon storage. So there's benefits to it. My idea of incentivizing carbon storage, and Hannah Pingree, who is the head of the Governor's Office of Policy and Innovation in the Future, actually said in support of my carbon storage bill, it's a jobs bill. Because if we were going to pay people who manage land in rural areas in Maine specifically money to document that they have done this, that they've stored carbon, sampled the soils to find out the carbon, then they have to pay people to do that. and those people, and they have to pay the people that are going to be doing the farm work that's different than what they're doing now. And but we'd be giving them money to do that. And so it puts jobs out into rural areas that right now don't have as much money or jobs. All right, so then Fred's other comment. There is carbon and there's organic matter. How can we prevent people from dumping carbon materials that will not decompose, or at least educate them? Good question. One of the challenges is that people put things on the land that they do not want to deal with. And in the case of our state, we made the error of encouraging people to put sludge from wastewater treatment plants onto land, and told the farmers that it would be a good source of nutrients. And in fact, it was a source, especially when that wastewater treatment was coming from paper mills, that the sludge has a lot of PFAS in it. So that's one of the problems we have. So people have been spreading organic materials that were waste, and that's been a problem. So as far as carbon materials that don't decompose, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. We have a problem with people who have dumped carpets, but that's not carbon materials. Tires.
I'm from New Jersey, and I'm a soil scientist who went to Rutgers and then University of Washington. And so I'm asking some odd questions, but the thing is, when I worked in New Jersey at the DEP, I mean, I know what people would do if they could get incentives and make money. They would dump things like coal and get credit for carbon. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what my question is.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's really important is to have somebody who thinks in the way that you game, that how would someone game the system on that? So that is a really great question. And I have been disappointed that when I work with people who are in the agriculture, conservation, and forestry department, they're just talking about incentivizing farmers and talking about the things that we already know, like no-till and cover crops. And what I say is there's organic matter from places along the East Coast that we could be spreading, and they kind of brown out. And I want them to say, actually, so Fred, we need to talk outside of this. So please email me and we'll set up a time, because I would like them to be the devil's advocate on what would be spread. And mostly they just, but I have the Associated Professional Foresters is very excited about this, because they get a lot of slash, and then they burning it means they might end up setting the forest on fire. And if they could chip it and spread it back out and get paid for that, then the time it takes to chip and spread would be worthwhile to them, and they wouldn't have to worry about the risk of burning down the very thing they're trying to make a living off of. Also, and part of the interest in burning is that they could make it into biochar, but right now to make biochar, which you say spreading coal, it's actually a good thing to spread biochar. There's been a lot of studies about how it is a long-term carbon storage, and it doesn't have a negative impact on the plants that are living, or that are there. But right now, the way to make biochar is to take all of that slash and all these wood products and take them to a place that they can get processed. And so that's a lot of driving material back and forth. So Fred, please do email me. So let's see, next question. President of Maine Sustainable Ag Society. I have always envisioned a program not unlike Chickadee Checkoff, where taxpayers could opt to donate $1 or more for soil health, helping to build the understanding that soil health is national wealth. Farmers really need help paying for regenerative methods to build soil health, since consumers are not willing to pay what it costs to grow food. That's a great idea, Nan.
Well, thanks. I've tried to get it going for ages, and you're clearly on this page, and we're all trying to figure out how. I mean, even the last soil health bill that was passed, they don't really seem to know how to how to, fund it, for instance, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of awareness or engagement. You've hit on all the highlights in your talk, and thank you very much. I do look forward to having a conversation with you personally offline. One of these
Yeah,
days.
contact me because we could come up with a bill for this.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it would be a real no-brainer, especially, and anyways, you're much more focused, it sounds like, on homeowners and so forth. And that's great. Those are the folks that have an awful lot of power and are huge polluters. And of course, farmers are the ones that get blamed for a lot of the nitrates in the waterways or whatever. And it's not usually the case, the phosphates and everything running downstream. Anyway, happy to talk to you about that. In my discovery, I think it only frankly generates about $35,000 a year, but there used to be a lot more chit chat about the chickadee stuff, 50 years ago. And now it's, whatever.
Well, so I have this bill, I call it the Tax the Rich bill, but it's a bill to put in a higher income, higher tax on over $125,000. So right now, any dollar you make that's $50,050. So if you make more than $50,050, you pay a higher tax than you would if you made under $50,050. But any amount you make up to the millions, you pay the same percent tax, 7.8%. So I put in, excuse me?
Right, you're talking about income tax? I'm confused.
Income tax.
Okay.
So I put in a bill to have that every dollar you make over $125,000 would be taxed at 11.15%. And some of the Republicans said, well, what do you want to use that money for? And what I learned talking with them is that they were very comfortable with the idea that you make a tax that's for a specific thing. My response to them is there's a bunch of things that have not been funded since the higher tax bracket disappeared and the amount of revenue it used to bring in.
Well, you know what? There's huge wisdom in that learning, quite frankly, that they want it to be tangible. And then there wouldn't be perhaps quite so much pushback. Anyway, my second comment in there speaks to exactly what you spoke to it after I'd made the comment, which was about the risk involved with storing carbon above ground, either from burning or, from rotting or things falling over or pests or whatever it might be. I mean, I'm just an advocate of, as someone who raises grass and raises animals and has made a life of it. I'm an advocate of storing carbon below ground. So I don't want that to be overlooked. And it also, thank you for speaking to the fact that it does cost more to be a good regenerative farmer. There's lots of money out there nowadays to be a quote organic farmer, but that's not the solution. Organics is great and organics is about the soil, but at the end of the day, regenerative practices are really the ones that are going to make the difference.
Yes, so I like your idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be a checkoff. Basically, I want to talk with you and I'll talk with people in the tax committee about how we might make a way for people to do this, for people to say that they think this is important and they want.
Well, and what it's going to be for, I think that, and what it's going to be for is going to matter. I mean,
yes,
and people on this Zoom you seem to be concerned about homeowners getting involved and not having avenues. I mean, I envisioned it for farmers because we have such a hard time making an actual living here. I mean, there's only about 20% of us farmers that actually make a living, and there's enough, and it's the 80% that get all those, frankly, all the benefits, and that the stakeholders are all concerned. Let's have this conversation offline. I don't want to bore everyone, but yeah, it's very, very challenging. And I understand, I don't want to dismiss the fact that there's homeowners that also want to make an impact. The point is that this is a way to really raise consciousness about this is a critically important subject.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad to talk about it. Well, because it's called Garden Club, I'm trying to focus, assuming that you're all gardeners. So I should have actually had you introduce yourselves and I would know who you were before I started to talk. So thank you for introducing yourselves. And there are, excuse me, so for the soil health bill, when I originally wanted to put carbon storage as part of the soil health bill and incentives for it, the pushback from the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, from the governor's side, was that because Shelley Pingree was working on the farm bill at the national level and is on the agriculture committee on the national level, that there would be money coming from the federal government for soil health. And so we were creating a placeholder for that money to come in. And that is why it did not have any money to do programs at the state level. So my present bill is, because has been no money yet from the federal government for soil health, specifically outside of what comes to NRCS. So that's why we're trying to put that into this new bill. And that would be for farmers, not for homeowners or gardeners. Okay, next question. I
No,
was
the next
surprised,
question,
Allison,
yeah.
I was surprised to learn how many golf courses there are in Maine. UMO has trails. Trials on grasses grown for them. Well, we are a vacation state, I guess.
So there is a question above that you may have missed from somebody who is asking about managing the wetlands on his or her property. I'm not a farmer, just a gardener. Do you see that one?
Yes. About 7 or 8 acres. My land is swamp, few large vernal pools. What else can you do? Protect it long term. So thank you for protecting it. There's a program that that not individuals, but towns and land trusts and community organizations can apply for money to improve the condition of wetlands. So all over the state, we have wetlands that what I call it trounced, that have been trounced by development or eliminated because there's a road over it or a building on it. But we know that it used to be a wetland. And now we have a law policy that federal and state policy that if what you do disturbs a wetland, then you have to pay money. And there's a program called the MNRCP, Maine Natural Resources Conservation Program, and people can apply. So it's not for a private landowner that has 7 or 8 acres, but one thing you could do is look into your community applying for that those funds. For several years, I was on the committee of specialists that reviewed those grant proposals. And they're very specific. So if 95 got widened in southern Maine and the places that it trounced wetlands, those wetlands were categorized. And so people could apply for money to recover or help wetlands that were those same types. So there's more money for it in the South because there's more development in the South. So then you could probably talk to a vernal pool specialist or the people at, I think there was someone from Maine Audubon, there were various specialists on this committee that might be able to talk to you about your particular, wetland and vernal pool area and how to improve them. But to get these grants funded, you actually have to have someone who's a specialist in your that knows about wetlands to advise you. So for example, someone may have realized they can't sell their land for development because now we have protections for vernal pools. And so instead of selling it for development, they donate it to the town, but it's already, maybe it was used as a quarry in part of it, or maybe people used to park cars on it or put waste on it. And it needs to be managed in a way to make it function as a wetland that's hopefully the way it used to function, and that the funding MNRCP could fund that. It wouldn't go to an individual. It could just go to a municipality or like a land trust. So that's a kind of vague. Your specific vernal pool, I probably could find names of people where you live that know about your vernal pools that you could either they do it for, I don't know if they do it for free, it depends on who they work for, or you would pay them as a consultant to walk your land with you and tell you how to improve it.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
In Maine, there is enough carbon sequestered in forest lands to offset, I think, about 75% of our emissions. And do you have any comments on what more we could be doing to increase our carbon stocks in Maine. We have actually a great potential in this state to have a positive balance instead of a negative balance.
Well, I will give you the comment I say to the people who came up with that, which is that looks so great. And doesn't it make it seem like Maine is doing such a great job? And I said, but I have, as a pedologist, as someone who's looked at how soils form over time, soils I looked at in Hawaii were, very old. Soils I looked at in Peru, thousands of years old. Hawaii, a little younger because they're volcanic. Anyway, actually here in Maine, say 10,000 years old, 10 to 20. In Hawaii, hundreds of thousands of years old. Excuse me, in Peru, hundreds of thousands of years old. And so basically, before we were ever burning fossil fuels here in Maine, the carbon was being pulled in by vegetation and stored in the ecosystem. So I think there's quite a bit of hubris for us to say that we are countering the CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere. It gets people excited about the possibility that we could manage the land to do a better job. And that's the part I like about it. But if we weren't here, that carbon would be pulled in, not to counter what we do, but just because that's what the forest does. And so basically my bill, that's part of what it's trying to get at, is that we do know, there's been plenty of studies for over 100 years, that when you cut trees, you lose CO2, not just because you export the biomass that are in the trees, but you lose organic matter from the soil, for what I said about the warming effect. And when you till, you're breaking up PEDs of soil and making more surface area. And so that's more available for the microbes to do their job. And so that's why no-till and cover crops, they're not making it so that you store more carbon, but you lose less carbon in the act of growing food, which we need to do to eat. So anyway, so that I'm trying to get at that we could encourage better forest practices. And there's a lot of push right now about how forests store carbon. But my experience is the majority of people on the forest carbon storage working group from the Climate Council were foresters, and they have, for as long as I've known foresters, when I was working in the Forest Service, they actually said the only good tree is a stump. They would say that, this tree is rotting on the stump, is how they would describe a tree, that they thought it was a shame it hadn't been cut. And so the people who are talking about forest carbon storage are often talking about silvicultural methods that allow trees to get bigger, individual trees. So they thin the forest to, as they say, release the tree that they see as a commodity. And even though they're talking the words soil carbon or forest carbon storage, their end goal is to put that tree into a mill. And I would like there to be more thought of what farmers do now. If you went out to a field, you wouldn't meet farmers who say, I can't wait until I just take that wetland and till it up. Already when I was working on farms 30 plus years ago, the farmer would be like, I don't want to go in that wetland because I'm going to lose the first tractor, and then I'm going to get the second tractor stuck trying to pull out the first tractor. But we don't have foresters that look at a forest landscape and say, I just want to leave that part alone because it's on the north facing slope, and it naturally has more organic matter in it. Even though I was talking about that in the late 80s, I've never met a forester that looks at a landscape and says, let's just leave this be because it's storing carbon. And I would love to get to that, to bring it all the way back to the beginning. I would love to get to the point where people who are foresters that work for companies that cut trees also think of how important it is to leave the vernal pool, not bother the riparian zone. And right now they don't want to buy the riparian zone because they don't want to get fined for bothering the riparian zone. And maybe don't tell the foresters I feel this way, but I haven't seen a lot of change in how foresters talk about forests that work for commodity companies that want to get the trees out.
So here's another question. What's the oldest soil you've studied?
So the oldest soil, so oxasols are soils that are, so I mostly, my master's I worked in North Carolina. I was studying ultisols in the coastal plain of North Carolina. That's where I was mapping. They're very red, like when I was a little kid, they had a laundry soap commercial about Georgia red clay. You couldn't get it out of your clothes. And those are ultisols. We don't, in the lower 48, we don't have oxasols. Oxasols are named that because they are so oxidized because they've been sitting out weathering for such a long period of time. So I did not ever do research on oxasols, but because I worked in Peru on ultisols, again, that were in the upper Amazon basin of Peru, I also went, because I was working for USAID, they sent me to Brazil and there were oxasols there. So they were, 1 million years old, whereas the ultisols are in the hundreds of thousands of years old. And of course, here in Maine, we have spotosols primarily, and they are, 10 to 20,000 years old. So we're younger. So in Hawaii, so for a while there, I would take any job that would get me to a different soil order. And so in Hawaii, I was working on andisols, which are soils formed from volcanic ash. And so they can be quite young. There's a lot of rainfall there, and so things start growing on them pretty quickly after they cool down.
So there are a couple of thank yous. Someone who found it interesting that they never thought about how old soils were before. Actually, the soils in Maine, you're right, are quite young because we were glaciated and pretty much everything was stripped off. So it's a very different environment from the tropics.
Right, and it's so cold here, right, that we don't have the, when you're I mostly worked in the humid tropics. So I went to Cornell as an undergrad, and then I went to NC State, and then I got to Peru because I was working in ultisols, and I went to work in ultisols in Peru. And then I just I had that stint for the Forest Service for about 5 years. But other than that, my research, my master's and my PhD were in tropical environments. So the soils are a lot older in places that haven't been glaciated.
But the carbon storage is a lot higher when you get further north because it's colder.
Right.
Decomposition is not as rapid. Are there any other questions from the audience out there? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Do you have any last words, Laurie?
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. It was very interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you, Laurie. Thank you for all the work you're doing in the legislature as well, advocating for all these policies and stuff. It's great. I loved hearing it all about it.
Julia, do you have a question? All right, I thought I saw her hand up.
No,
All right, well,
no hands.
contact me anytime if you have ideas for bills. So Nan and I are going to talk about how we might get some money for regenerative agriculture. And yeah, so contact me. I'd love to talk with people about how we might take the things that we think there ought to be a law and put them into law.
Lori, do you know how to find me?
I just put your name down, and I'm sure that
You'll find me.
Barbara,
Okay.
can you give me contact information?
Thank you. Queen@getwool.com. Very easy.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Queen@getwell.com.
Get wool.
Get wool.
Get wool.
Yeah, which is indeed a euphemism for getting well, because wool is how we're going to save this planet at the end of the day.
All right, I have to hear more about that. I'll be in touch.
Gotta get off the fashion train. Anyway, okay, thanks. We'll talk.
All right, bye. Thanks so much for
Bye.
having me. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.